You know, after the 2014 election, the American people decided to change the Senate. And as I said during my campaign in 2014, I had enjoyed being the defensive coordinator. If you're a football fan, you know what the defensive coordinator is. It's hard to score on defense. You can occasionally, but it's easier to put points on the board if you're the offensive coordinator. And in the U.S. Senate, the offensive coordinator is the majority leader who sets the schedule. It doesn't always guarantee the outcome, particularly in a body that requires 60 to do most things, but gives you a chance to change directions. And so I inherited a Senate that was completely and totally dysfunctional. Let me explain what I mean. In the whole year 2014, the last year of the previous majority, we had 15 roll call votes on amendments in the whole year. In the first year of the new majority, we had over 200. So what I decided to do is to open the place up and give everybody a chance to participate, because everybody got duly elected in some state in America with a majority of the votes, and people expected them to be able to have an impact. I knew in divided government we certainly had big differences with the administration, and so the question is, when the American people choose divided government, what are they saying? I think what they're saying is, we know you have a lot of big differences, but why don't you look for the things you can agree on that are worth doing and do those? So that was my scheduling strategy for the new majority. Obviously, with Barack Obama in the White House, there were plenty of differences, but a lot of things just had been stacking up and unaddressed literally for years. I think I heard in the introduction a reference to No Child Left Behind, a very unpopular bill passed in the early part of the previous decade. That allowed us to pass it by such a large majority that even though the president may have had some reservations about sending power out of Washington back to the states, he signed it nevertheless. A highway bill, you'd think that'd be simple. We'd done nothing but short-term extensions on highway bills going back to the 90s. We passed a 5-year highway bill, which brings stability for state governments and for those who construct roads and repair roads, some certainty to the funding stream. We did cybersecurity. We made the internet tax moratorium permanent. We made Section 179 of the tax code, which is particularly important to small businesses and family farms, permanent. We made R&D tax credit permanent. We passed a comprehensive sanctions bill against North Korea. The heroin and opioid challenge, just to give you a sense of how pervasive this epidemic is. You know, I have people in the Republican conference in the Senate running for President of the United States. They'd come back from New Hampshire saying, believe it or not, the biggest issue up here in New Hampshire is the heroin problem. So you'd think it'd be easy to address something like that. The problem with that kind of bill is that everybody wants to lead the parade. So the challenge was to deal with all of these competing egos who wanted, honestly, to be thought of as the person who got this bill through. And it ended up being quite a challenge. We had 12 overdoses in Montgomery County, Mount Sterling, Kentucky, the other day, in one day. So this is a dreadful epidemic. Now, what do all these issues have in common? They're important, worth doing, and can get a presidential signature. Now, we have big differences with this administration. I mean, after 8 years, I think it's pretty safe to give it a grade. The president wouldn't have put it this way, but I think he wanted to Europeanize America. That means big debts, high taxes on small businesses, massive overregulation, and then what do you get from that? Of course, you get slow growth. We haven't had a single year of 3% growth rate, not 1 year in 8. And I think the statute of limitations is run on blaming George W. Bush for everything. In fact, the pattern in our country is the deeper the recession, the quicker the bounce back. But not this time. We had a deep recession and a tepid recovery. What I hear all across the country, and I move around the country a good bit in my other job as the majority leader of the Senate, and I've heard from all of you, almost everyone in this room at one point or another, is you're being massively overregulated, no matter what business you're in. It's been a regulatory rampage going on all across America for 8 years. That's what produces this kind of tepid growth rate. With a low growth rate, of course, you have fewer jobs and opportunities for the next generation. Less opportunity for young people. We need to take our foot off the brake and put it on the accelerator and get this country going again. And I think the single best thing the new president could do, whoever it may be, would be to try to deal with this regulatory nightmare, healthcare, financial services. Look what EPA has done to the coal industry. It's a depression down there. On and on and on, all across our economy. Now, I want to touch on one other issue, and then I'll go to questions. Almost everything we do requires a presidential signature. And I run into people all the time and say, why can't you do something about this regulation or that regulation? Well, the only tool you have is to write into a bill, no money shall be spent to do a certain thing. Well, obviously the president's not going to sign a bill that prevents him from doing what he wants to do. So there are very limited opportunities to stop a regulatory rampage, and what the president has done is push the envelope as far as he can. He knows he can keep us from undoing it, and he's hopeful the courts, even if they ever get around to it, by the time the courts stop a particular regulation, as they have done at least momentarily with waters of the United States, which turns virtually every puddle in America into an EPA regulated activity, even if you finally get a court resolution of it, the behavior may have been fundamentally changed. That's certainly going on with utilities. Even though there's a current stay against one of the Clean Power Plant regulations, the utilities have to change directions that they think we're going in, and even if you get relief a few years down the road, it may be too late. In fact, Gina McCarthy, I think at one point said, we win either way, because by the time the courts get around to it, everybody will have adjusted their behavior. If we want to have an America that's growing and vibrant, we need to do something about this regulatory rampage, and I hope the next president will, because virtually every bit of it is not a result of legislation. Much of it is in healthcare and financial services, but not in other areas. Speaking of healthcare, I don't think there's any question that Obamacare is crashing. It will be revisited by the next president, whoever that is. Because everything we predicted, I mean not a single Republican in the House or Senate voted for it, everything has happened. Higher premiums, higher co-payments, higher deductibles, chaos in the private health insurance market. You've got a bill here that encourages everybody to merge and get bigger, and then you've got a federal administration that is of two minds. At the same time they're pushing everybody to merge and get bigger, the Justice Department is trying to stop mergers and acquisitions among private healthcare insurance companies, as you've seen with the Aetna-Humana deal. All of this was entirely predictable. Entirely predictable. And while a few more people may have become insured, the last figure I heard is that we've gone from 40 million uninsured down to 30. The question is, what is the cost-benefit ratio for all of that? The chaos in the private health insurance market. From a Medicaid expansion point of view, the state governments starting next year are going to have to pick up a significant portion of the newly eligible as a result of the Medicaid expansion. We'll see how they can figure out how to pay for that. So it's a real crisis coming down the track for state governments as well. So my prediction is that Obamacare will be revisited next year, no matter who wins the election, no matter who's in control of Congress, because things that can't work won't work and will need to be revisited by popular demand from people all across the country. The final thing I would say is the Supreme Court. You know, we had a vacancy that occurred, as all of you know, in February. this is one of those issues where we have joint responsibility. Unlike stopping a regulation where we'd have to get the president's permission, in effect, by signing a bill that would keep him from doing what he's doing, court appointments and other appointments, we have a joint responsibility. He makes the nomination, and we decide whether to confirm. I said pretty early on, after Justice Scalia passed away, that the current president on the way out the door would not fill the vacancy. There was a pretty controversial decision, but if you think about it, it was entirely consistent with history. It had been 80 years, 80, since a vacancy on the Supreme Court occurring in the middle of a presidential election year was filled. You'd have to go back to 1888, Grover Cleveland. You all remember that well? Grover Cleveland in the White House, to find the last time a vacancy on the Supreme Court created in the middle of a presidential election year was confirmed by the Senate of a party different from the president. So I knew if the shoe was on the other foot, they would have the same view. And of course, it was helpful that the vice president in 1992, a presidential election year, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, said if a vacancy had occurred, there was not one, but if it had occurred, they wouldn't fill it. And it was also helpful that Harry Reid had said the president nominates, but we don't have to vote. And it was also helpful that Chuck Schumer, who will be succeeding Harry Reid as the Democratic leader next year, said 18 months before the end of Bush 43, if there's a vacancy, we won't fill it. So this vacancy will be filled by the next president. It's an extremely important vacancy. Everybody's focused on the Supreme Court because it has such a huge impact on so much of what we do in our country.